This is my 63rd video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 37th, dealing with my third layout made using mainly Hornby EZ Track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby EZ Track layout, when I already had an OO gauge layout using Bachmann EZ Track. This part, however, isn't really so much about the layout. This part features a rolling stock kit build, specifically the Parkside, now sold by Peco, previously Parkside-Dundas, LMS Cattle Wagon kit, PC87. Also featured in this video will be the Bachmann 3F Jinty tank loco, but I'll do a proper video on the Jinty another time. It's here just because I wanted to get it onto the layout and use it for the initial running trials of the kit-built wagons. This kit build was a very long-winded one for me. It took me something like 10 months from starting to build one of these kits until finishing them both. I'd bought 2. You'll see why this was as we go along. Anyway, here is the kit as it now comes packaged from Peco. It's in a clear acetate box with a printed card insert. In Canada, I paid $24 each for these kits. The UK recommended retail price is £12.25. For comparison, I typically pay between 20 and 30 Canadian dollars for complete ready-to-run wagons, if I can find what I want locally. Here's the first of the kits as I initially unpacked it. Several sprues of grey plastic parts in a couple of different shades of grey. The floor came as a loose part. Then there were a couple of small black sprues, a bag with wheeled axles and brass axle bearings, 2 pieces of thin brass wire, a piece of thin styrene strip, a very small sheet of decals, and a sheet of instructions. And here I have to voice my first fairly severe criticism of this kit. The box is labelled LMS Cattle Truck and states transfers included. Well, yes, some transfers are included, but not ones that would actually allow you to build an LMS cattle truck. The transfers provided are only suitable for a minimal BR livery. If you want to actually build this kit as an LMS cattle truck, you will need to provide your own transfers. To my mind, this is downright corrupt, deceptive marketing. Whilst we're talking about things that are not included, the kit does not include any couplings, so those are another thing that you'll have to provide yourself in order to complete a running wagon. The kit does include 3 different styles of coupling mounting blocks to allow you to mount various different styles of couplings, including NEM, but they're just blocks, not actual NEM pockets. Anyway, having unpacked the first of these kits, I started to build it, following the included instructions. The first thing you need to do is use a sharp knife to cut off part of the side walls of the wagons. To save having to actually mould separate left and right sides, Peco or Parkside have both sides provided as exact duplicates, and you have to cut off the fittings for the dividing partitions in the side window gaps from the left of one part and the right of the other, since these fittings should only be present at one end of the wagon. You can see here where the side at left has the fittings in both openings, and I have just shaved off the fittings from one opening of the side at right. Once that has been done, the sides and the ends of the wagon can be assembled to the floor. The instructions say something about removing ejection marks from the rear of the buffer beams. I couldn't really see what they meant by that. Generally the parts were very well cast with hardly any flash, although there were some awkward ejection marks that needed shaving off, not that I could see on the buffer beams, but definitely, for example, on the back of the sole bars. It was at this point that I ran into a fairly severe problem with the kit that I was working on. The next instruction said to insert the small brass axle bearings into the holes in the axle box parts, part 9. Here is the sheet from the instructions showing the key to the parts. Part 9 is labelled at the bottom of the sprue at centre top. Since this sprue appears to contain 2 axle box parts, you will obviously need 4 for the wagon. The kit should presumably include 2 of these sprues. The problem was my kit did not include those sprues at all. I opened the other kit that I had bought and found that it also did not contain these sprues. Fortunately, I bought these kits locally from Nigel with British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario. I contacted Nigel about this problem, sending him this image to clarify the issue. He said that he couldn't help me immediately as he had no more of this kit in stock to check, but he said that he would contact the manufacturer about getting the missing parts. Well, eventually I did get the missing parts. Peco first sent the brass axle bearings, although I believe Nigel had passed on my explanation, which should have clearly indicated that what was missing was the plastic sprues with the axle box parts, not the brass bearings. Anyway, Nigel had to get back to Peco again, and they did eventually ship 4 sprues, providing the missing 2 sprues for each of the kits I'd bought. So that was good. However, by the time I received those sprues, some months after starting the first kit, I was deep into building my Hornby layout, and so not really wanting to work on rolling stock kits. So I checked that the parts supplied appeared finally to be complete and correct, and then I put the kits aside. So, finally, I got them out again just recently, as my Hornby layout is now virtually complete. Here's one of the kits with the newly supplied parts at bottom centre. The assembled sides and floor, which I did months previously, are at bottom left. Here's a close-up of the assembled sides and floor. They fit together pretty well, although I was initially a bit confused as to what level the floor was supposed to go at. You can then fit the partition, if desired, between the fittings and the window openings at one end of the wagon. Historically, the reason for these partitions is that there was a requirement to provide small, medium and large cattle wagons, and eventually, rather than having completely separate diagrams for each size, the LMS just built large cattle wagons and provided removable partitions that could be used to convert a large cattle wagon to small or medium as needed. Here are the verbal instructions for kit assembly, and the instructions are entirely verbal. There are pictures of line drawings of a completed wagon, but otherwise there are no illustrations as part of the instructions. Where I initially got stuck was at the start of the 3rd paragraph, as I found that I did not in fact have any W iron mouldings Part 9, as they call them, but now I'd received them. And here they are, taken from their sprues. Basically, these are the axle boxes with their fittings and their spring suspension. The brass axle bearings need to be inserted into the holes in the axle boxes. You can see one of the holes in question at bottom centre. The brass bearings themselves come in the bag with the wheels, which is a good idea as they're quite tiny and could easily be lost otherwise. Here's a close-up of the bag. You can see the tiny brass bearing pieces at the bottom of the bag. And here they are taken out of the bag. These are the standard hat type of brass bearings. I do actually have spares of these, so I could have dealt with these being missing or lost. The bearings need to be fitted into the holes in the plastic axle box parts. The instructions suggest using poly cement in the hole to soften the plastic and make insertion easier. I tried this on the first one, and then decided it was doing more harm than good, making unnecessary mess without really helping much, so I inserted the remaining bearings without using any poly cement. I just positioned the bearing with tweezers and then squeezed it firmly into the hole with small pliers, as seen here. The axle box parts then glue to the back of the sole bars, fitting into the outside rectangular recesses. I should have removed the ejection marks from the sole bar before doing this, as those ejection marks will actually stop the sole bar fitting to the wagon floor properly, and it's harder to remove them after the other parts have been glued to the sole bars. Here are both sole bars after fitting of the axle box parts, one bar seen from the front and one from the back. Next, the back parts of the brake hangers needed to be fitted into the centre recesses in the back of the sole bars. And and here are the sole bars after the fitting of those brake hangers. The sole bars now need to be fitted to the wagon. As mentioned, they won't fit properly as those ejection marks are right where the sole bars need to be fitted against the ribs on the wagon floor. So it is really necessary to remove those ejection marks in order to properly fit the sole bars. The instructions say to glue the sole bars in place and then to insert the axles into the bearings. I actually inserted the axles at the same time as I glued the sole bars in place, as I wanted to be sure that the spacing was correct and that the wheels would run properly. Here you can see how the points on the ends of the plastic axles fit into the small brass bearings. Obviously the spacing between the sole bars is critical to getting this to work well. The next parts to be fitted are the brake rods with the brake shoes. Unfortunately, whilst trying to clean off these small parts after cutting them from the sprue, I managed to stab my finger with my knife. Well, stab is a bit overdramatic. I didn't actually slip or anything, I was just holding the knife whilst trying to manipulate the small part into the right orientation to work on it, and I wasn't careful enough about where the point of the knife was, and it pricked my finger. But I'd put in a new blade when starting on this kit, so it was extremely sharp, and even with no force behind it, it went in deep, and it took me quite a while to get it to stop bleeding. So easy to do. A really sharp knife can hurt you just with a touch, even with no force behind it. So it was actually the next day before I resumed work on the kit. I blackened the brake parts before fitting them, as I thought it might be difficult to paint them afterwards, since the shoes would be so close to the wheels. The trick with fitting these parts is to get them nicely lined up so they really look as though they could stop the wheels turning without having them touch the wheels and actually stop them turning. Next, the brake levers need to be fitted. The instructions don't say much about how these should be fitted, so your best guide is the illustration on the instruction sheet or other illustrations you may have of similar wagons. I assumed that the bottom end of the lever must fit between the two brake hanger parts, and then the top of the lever just sort of glues onto the sole bar. There's no real fitting for the lever on the sole bar. Next, the coupling hooks and buffer heads are fitted onto the buffer beams. These are provided as black plastic parts. I would have thought it would have made more sense to also supply the brake and axle block parts in black, but those came as grey plastic. The buffer heads don't remotely fit into the holes where they're supposed to go. The instructions do mention that you may need to open out the holes with a 3/64" drill. Frankly, even after doing that, they still didn't fit. So I cut down the pins on the buffer heads and used a knife to open out the mouths of the holes. I was able to get the parts to fit like that. But with hindsight, it would probably have made more sense to leave these parts off until after painting the wagons. Here's the other end of the wagon with its hooks and buffers fitted. Next to the wagon you can see the two thin brass rods that came with the kit, and also the thin plastic strip. Here's what the instructions say about these. You need to cut pieces to length yourself and fit them to the sides of the wagon. This is extremely fiddly to do, especially for the brass rods. I measured against the side openings of the wagon to ensure that I got the length right. It isn't easy to cut the brass rod, a knife isn't going to do it. Scissors would likely mangle the rod. Pliers would be hard to use precisely enough. I ended up using a pair of toenail clippers that I keep on my workbench for jobs like this. If you should lose one of the little pieces of brass rod, you'd be out of luck, as the kit does not provide enough for any spares. The tiny piece in the foreground here is all that I had left from one of the brass rods supplied after cutting out the pieces for one side of the wagon. Gluing these rods in place is the very devil. The instructions suggest using CA glue, which is what I did. I don't know what else you could possibly use, but trying to position these little rods precisely and then glue them in place with CA is tricky indeed. I concluded that there was no hope of doing it by applying CA to the rod first and then positioning it. So I positioned the rods first without glue and then applied tiny drops of CA to the joins with the tip of a toothpick, under strong light and using magnifying glasses. Frankly, even so, I made kind of a mess of it. but I really can't see how else it could have been done. Here are the brass rods on the other side of this first wagon. There's a limit to how little CA you can possibly apply and still have it stick the rod in place, so blobs of glue on the ends of the rods were pretty much unavoidable, or so it seemed to me. I did try to remove some of the excess glue with cotton buds. The styrene strip is a bit easier as you can cut it with a knife, so it's not hard to make exact lengths. Again, not enough spare is provided to give you an extra part should you lose or damage one. The 4 strips required are at left, and at right is all that is left over. The strips are supposed to glue to the sides of the wagon to provide the diagonals. It doesn't help that bosses are cast onto the wagon sides precisely where these strips need to attach. I ended up slicing off those bosses, as you wouldn't see them behind the strips anyway, and they prevent the strips from lying flat and attaching properly. Here's my initial attempt to glue those strips in place. I felt that they looked kind of stupid like this, and I ended up cutting off the ends at a diagonal to make them look more sensible. I got more glue than I should have on things trying to fit these strips. 3 types of coupling mounting blocks are supplied. The black pieces at the top are intended to work with Bachmann NEM pockets. Then there are blocks at top and bottom of the grey sprue for different types of screw-on couplings. What I had on hand were these Bachmann couplings, and they seemed to fit onto the Type B mounting blocks, as shown here. So I glued Type B blocks underneath the ends of the wagon. And there's one wagon more or less complete. The roof won't be glued on until later, and couplings haven't been fitted yet. Also, I haven't cut the ends of the diagonal side strips yet. I could have done a better job with those brass rods. I think I did do a slightly better job on the second wagon. I went straight ahead with assembling the second wagon before doing painting and decalling. It's easier to see how the sides of the wagon fit to the ends than to see how either fit to the floor, so I glued the sides to the ends first. First one end, and then the other. Then once those are assembled, it's clearer where the floor is supposed to go. The floor lines up with the bottom of the side, placing it above the buffer beams on the ends. And finally, the last side can be glued in place. And then the partition can be inserted as desired. I put partitions into both wagons, one in the small position and one in the medium position. And here are the 2 wagons assembled. And here without flash. For comparison, I got out a Bachmann ready-to-run LMS Cattle Wagon. Here's the Bachmann wagon between the 2 kit-built ones. Clearly the Bachmann wagon is not a large. I masked up the wagons for painting. Initially I wanted to paint the interior brown, so I put masking tape round the tops on the outside, and I used tack putty to mask the coupling hooks and buffers. At the same time as I sprayed the interiors brown, I sprayed the roofs a slightly dark grey. Next, I used card and tissues to mask the insides of the wagons and created little card frames to stand them on so that the wheels wouldn't get sprayed. Like that, I sprayed the outside of the wagons with a slightly lighter grey. This certainly helped to blend in the brass rods and the diagonal strips, which I have cut to fit better by this point. Here are the wagons after the removal of that masking. And here without flash. I hand-painted black the axle boxes and their suspension, the brake rigging and the coupling mounting blocks. And here are the wagons stood up after that. I didn't bother to paint the whole bottoms of the wagons black, as I figured those wouldn't be seen anyway. The decals that came with the kits, apart from being completely inadequate to make LMS wagons, weren't very good. They were made with extremely thin decal filming, so it was very hard to apply them without breaking them. I used some Model Master LMS decals that I had on hand for the LMS lettering. Apparently the decals in the kit were also made by Model Master, but the ones that I had for the lettering seemed to be much better quality and were quite easy to work with, which was just as well as positioning the letters around the diagonals was fiddly. Here's one side of one of the wagons, decalled. And here's the other wagon. A bit of the number is missing as it broke whilst I was trying to apply it. I had sprayed the wagons inside and out, and I had not masked the tops of the ends and the sides, so those had 2 coats of paint on them. I needed to scrape that paint off in order to fit the roofs, as polycement will only glue bare styrene plastic. Having scraped off the paint from the fitting surfaces, I glued the roofs in place. Afterwards I kicked myself for not adding some weight inside the wagons before doing this. They're very light otherwise, and a bit of weight would really help to ensure better running. I put the wagons back on their card frames and sprayed a coat of matte acrylic fixative over everything once the decals had time to dry properly. In front are all the parts that I had left over, quite a few, as they seem to use standard sprues for many different wagon kits. I'll save these extra parts as they might come in handy for something in the future. Here are the wagons with couplings fitted, joined up between a brake van and the Bachmann Cattle Wagon. I had this Bachmann Jinty loco, which I bought on eBay UK and which had been delivered a while ago, so I decided to get it onto the layout to use in trying out these wagons. Here's the loco still in its block of ice in the box. And here's the block taken out. It didn't come with any parts bag, but apparently this model doesn't. Here's the block opened. It's quite a handsome looking model, definitely closer to an actual Jinty than the Hornby version, which is very old by now. A great little runner, but a bit approximate as a model in some ways. And here's the Bachmann Jinty completely out of its packaging. It doesn't have painted cab detail or cylinder gear under the boiler, but really viewed normally it's a pretty good model of its prototype. Here it is on the tracks, looking ready to work, to me at least. I wasn't honestly sure whether I'd bought this loco as new or as used very good condition, and eBay wouldn't tell me as that's not something they deem worth including in order details. I think it probably was new, so I figured I'd better run it in. So, just a little video of the Jinty running in. It ran rather slower than I would have expected, so this running in was at about 60% power or a little more. With the Jinty run in, I got the cattle wagons onto the tracks. Here they are with flash. Not bad looking, but I'd be hesitant to recommend this kit. Apart from my problems with missing parts, if you want an LMS wagon, you'll need to provide your own decals. You'll also need to provide your own couplings, so your overall cost will likely be higher than for a good ready-to-run wagon, and you'll have to struggle with some very fiddly work, especially with those brass rods. Anyway, now to finish, let's see the wagons actually running on the layout. Okay, let's see if we can just do a little running with these kit-built cattle wagons. I'm going the wrong way. See if we can hook them up. Now, I forgot to put weight in them. Always do that. I really should have put some weight in them, and I forgot. I think that couple, this is the little Bachmann Jinty here, which I just ran in, which I'm coupling to them. Let's see how they run. A bit surprised by how slow this Bachmann Jinty goes. Let's run in now. It seems to me I have to run it at about 60% or so. That's 60% to get what seems like a reasonable kind of running speed. Well, they got round at least once without derailing. I wish I put some weight in them. I always do that when I'm building kits, I'm afraid. I've done it more than once. I should put a sign on my wall saying, remember to put weight in. Because, of course, the commercial wagons do have weight in. They almost always put a metal plate that's a mainline wagon. Oh, no, it's a Bachmann, actually, the one behind them. And then that's a kit-built brake van on the back. But the Bachmann cattle wagon, which is a noticeably smaller one and a lighter colour than the kit-built ones, but it does have a metal plate in its chassis, which gives it a little bit more weight. And I could have put a little bit of lead or something. I've got some sticky lead weights that are 1/4 ounce or whatever. I could have put one of them in the middle. You wouldn't have seen it through the grills, I don't think, and it would have added some weight, so it would have provided a better guarantee of running. As it is, they're extremely light. I forgot the weight on that brake van as well. That brake van's also extremely light. So the only wagon in that little train that actually has any weight to it really is the Bachmann commercial wagon. Let me see if I can slow down here. Whoops. No, I'm saying whoops because you could see. See, this is because of the lack of weight. You could see the wagon rocking a bit as it went over the point. It didn't derail, but I can see it. Let's slow down. That's about 45% power there on the Jinty. He does get over the points. Well, he has pickups on all of his wheels. But he's going pretty darn slowly. Goes a little bit more slowly at that end of the layout, which is just because he's further from the power point. The power point is here, so all the power on that inner circuit is coming from here. I had to solder it here. That joint there was not passing power for some reason. This is the joint at the end here, and I had to solder it. Otherwise, whenever I set this point, there was no power on the back of this line at all. Because the power feed is here, that join wasn't sending power, so if I changed that point, there was only power on this little bit here. And I'm not, I don't know why it suddenly decided to stop sending power. But, I'm not going to try and rip the track up and redo the fish plate at this point, when the track's all, down and ballasted and everything, so I just got my soldering station up and soldered that joint, which fixed the problem. Anyway, let's bring these back round one more time. Just give them a teeny bit more power. They don't look bad. now, I don't think. But, you know, you have to add your own decals and your own couplings, so... and it's fiddly as heck to do those wire railings and everything. Still, there you go. The Parkside kit-built LMS Cattle Wagons.